Another possible way for cities to relieve pressure on taxpayers is by getting more done for less, and that can mean outsourcing. The idea is being explored by the Pioneer Institute, and joining us from the Institute is the Program Manager for Middle Cities and Director of Healthcare Policy, Joshua Archambault. Thank you very much for being with us, Joshua.
You're welcome, Chris.
First of all, is there really that much that cities and towns could potentially be saving by doing something like this?
You know, it depends on the city and town and where they're located, but there can be drastic savings here. Let me give you one example, for instance. Out in Springfield, Massachusetts, when they went and outsourced a few years ago the grounds maintenance, they saved 75% of the cost that they had previously spent. That's a variety of reasons. You know, first, specialized knowledge. Wages, benefits, benefits tend to be a little bit more generous in the public sector. So there's a number of ways that communities can save on outsourcing.
What about wages? Are we talking about wages that are so low that some people might not be comfortable with that? Or are we just talking about getting people who are cost efficient?
You know, it's a great question, Chris. When we usually think about outsourcing in the private sector, we think about sending jobs abroad. But when it comes to municipal level issues, usually you're outsourcing to a local company or to a nonprofit or to maybe even to another government. So it's not about getting a race to the bottom on wages. It's merely about being able to have flexibility with your workers in a way that you may not be able to do in-house.
How do you tell what areas of, let's say, city government are the best to try this with?
Sure. The reason Pioneer put out this research is we kept talking to local officials that didn't quite know how to go about this process. And it's pretty easy. First, you need to identify what you might want to outsource and see if you can actually measure it. Then you need to find out if there's companies that are actually doing that in the market. And then you need to look at whether you can actually manage that process going forward. Even if you don't end up outsourcing, there can be a large benefit to municipalities just looking at these issues and seeing if you can actually measure performance. Are you doing a good job at delivering services to your taxpayers?
What about the leverage of these communities? Because first of all, they have to know if the job's being done well, and,
Sure.
and if it isn't, they need some leverage to get someone else to do it, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and we emphasize in our research and in conversations that we have with local officials, that they write very tight contracts, that they understand the restrictions and the rules of the road that they have with folks that they may be outsourcing with, and make sure that they have a way they can fire somebody if they're not doing a good job.
What about in Boston? Because, I mean, in some senses, some people sometimes say there's very little of this in Boston, and on the other hand, there are some examples that, in a way, have been around for a long time.
Sure. You know, Boston may be a somewhat unique example because of just how large they are in this state. They can do most things inside of their internal processes because of the economies of scales that they have. There are a few examples in Boston. Trash collection is one in particular in which they've decided to outsource because it makes more sense for them to do it that way.
And of course, with snow removal, I imagine at least parts of the city must get some extra help.
Yeah,
when it comes down
I think so, especially the last few years when we've had so much snow. They still use their regular Department of Public Works employees to do most of the plowing. But as you said, in certain neighborhoods, they may ask local folks, sign contracts with local plowers to come in and help out, especially when it's a bad snowstorm.
Do you think that this is something cities are going to have to really do on a much larger scale in years to come?
You know, I think with the drying up of stimulus money, they have to look at all sorts of options. Here in Massachusetts, there's been a lot of conversation about municipal health care. We think at Pioneer the next conversation has to be about outsourcing and regionalization. There's always a lot of talk about it, but communities may actually need to move forward this time.
By the way, I know you've been looking at healthcare as well. The state has given some new powers to cities and towns in this. Boston, we have a temporary agreement, but overall, how much of a difference do you think this is going to make?
Well, I think there's widespread agreement that there will be savings in the plan. Those of us at Pioneer are a little bit more skeptical about the process they set in place and are worried, and we'll be monitoring whether that process is actually followed and whether there can be some, you know, behind closed door dealings. But certainly there will be some savings, and we'd like to see that the legislature monitor that process, and if they need to go back, they might need to.
Right. And what about the impediments to outsourcing? Because, you know, we have a lot of workers in some cities and towns, especially Boston,
Sure.
have union representation, and, you know, they might feel that, hey, you know, we haven't been doing a particularly bad job. Don't blame us if it's not well managed. So what about that?
You know, I think you've hit on one of the biggest challenging with outsourcing. It's political will. It's dealing with unions and saying, look, there may be situations here where we can actually help you do a better job. In particular, I'm thinking of Department of Public Works, may be a great example of this. Union members, it's not about firing them, but there may be a hybrid approach in which the private sector can offer to do things that maybe the union members don't care to do or aren't trained to do. So it can be a win-win situation. It does not have to be a race to the bottom, as I mentioned before.
And of course, in Boston, school bus drivers, it's really they're private employees working on the city's buses, and they're unionized, and sometimes they're rather contentious.
Yeah, I think that another importance here is that there is the management expertise in a municipality to be able to look over those contracts and make sure that performance is living up to what was promised.
All right, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
From the Pioneer Institute, Joshua Archambault. Up ahead, the arts segment with Chris Harding.